The evening had settled over the sleepy town, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns of the quiet suburban neighborhood. Jake Miller, the town's sheriff, had just clocked off from a grueling 12-hour shift. His muscles were sore, his mind a haze of fatigue, and all he wanted was a quiet night at home. As he rolled into his driveway, the soft hum of his engine was the only sound, the silence of the streets oddly soothing. But something didn't feel right. His headlights sliced through the dusk, illuminating the street in front of him. There, just beyond the curb, two men stood by his mailbox, standing too still, their backs rigid as they faced his house. They wore khaki uniforms, the kind that might have fit a low-level security guard or a neighborhood patrol officer. But the problem was, Jake didn't recognize them. He narrowed his eyes, instinctively tapping the brake to slow the car. These weren't the usual faces around here. In a neighborhood as tight-knit as this one, he knew everyone: neighbors, contractors, the occasional lost driver. These men, however, were strangers. The taller one looked over his shoulder, meeting Jake's gaze through the windshield. His eyes didn't flicker, didn't betray even the slightest recognition. A chill crawled up Jake's spine. There was something about the way they stood, too much like they were waiting for something or someone. The second man, shorter but stockier, held a clipboard in one hand, while the other gripped something Jake couldn't make out, his fingers wrapped tightly around it like a secret. Jake's instincts, honed through years of law enforcement, buzzed in his chest. He could sense the tension in the air, the palpable unease that made his gut twist. He had seen this look before in criminals who thought they could get away with something, in people who were hiding behind masks. He turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The men didn't move at first, as if waiting for Jake to make the next move. Their eyes never left him. "Evening," Jake said, his voice measured but sharp. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The taller man's lips twitched into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're with the HOA," he said, his tone too polished, too rehearsed. "We've come to issue a citation for a violation." Jake raised an eyebrow, his mind immediately snapping into alert. The HOA. He had never seen them send anyone out like this before. Not in his quiet suburban neighborhood, and certainly not at this hour. He glanced down at the clipboard the man was holding, but it was positioned just out of sight. That alone made Jake suspicious. "A citation," Jake repeated, his voice steady but with a hint of skepticism. "For what violation?" The shorter man stepped forward, his face stern now. "Your yard," he said, nodding toward Jake's driveway where his trash bins were placed. "It doesn't meet HOA standards." He gestured vaguely, as though the vague accusation was enough to justify his presence. Jake's mind began to churn, but he forced himself to remain calm. This didn't add up. His property was in perfect condition. He made sure of it. No one from the HOA had ever approached him about issues like this before. He opened his mouth to ask more questions, but before he could, the taller man cut him off with a sudden shift in tone. "We're going to need you to come with us," he said, his voice hardening. Jake froze. That wasn't right. "Come with you," he repeated slowly, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. "For what reason?" The taller man didn't answer directly. Instead, his gaze flickered to the shorter man, who began moving, his hand sliding toward his waist. Was that a set of handcuffs? Jake's stomach lurched as adrenaline surged through him. This wasn't a citation. This wasn't even an HOA issue. The two men had no right to ask him anything, let alone detain him. And as the shorter man took a step closer, his fingers still on whatever he had at his side, Jake realized what was happening. These weren't just some overzealous neighborhood watch officers. These men were here to arrest him. His fingers twitched near his holster as he instinctively moved to assert his authority. He'd faced dangerous situations before, but there was something about these two, something cold and calculated, that made his gut twist. They weren't just after his trash bins. They were after something more. The night suddenly felt darker. The peaceful suburban street around him was no longer calm. It was charged with a sense of imminent danger. And just as he stepped forward, ready to confront them, the shorter man spoke, his voice low but dripping with a strange kind of finality. "You need to come with us, Sheriff," he said, his words sending a shiver down Jake's spine. Sheriff. Jake's breath caught. How did they know who he was? What was going on? The chill deepened, and the tension in the air thickened. Jake wasn't just facing a random encounter with some misguided HOA representatives. He was staring down something much bigger. And the worst part was, he had no idea what they wanted, or how far they were willing to go to get it. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the words hung in the air. Sheriff. It wasn't just a casual slip of the tongue. It was deliberate, calculated. The taller man had recognized him. But how? Was this just an elaborate ruse, or was there something more sinister at play? The two men took another step toward him, their movements deliberate, almost predatory. Jake stood tall, his boots rooted to the gravel of his driveway, refusing to give an inch. He could feel his pulse throbbing in his ears, a quiet warning from his instincts. "I don't think you fully understand," Jake said, his voice sharp, the authoritative tone of a sheriff cutting through the tension. "I'm not going anywhere with you." His hand hovered near his waist, instinctively moving toward his badge as a reminder of the power he held. He was the law here, not these imposters. But the taller man, his lips curling into a thin, unsettling smile, only leaned in closer. "You misunderstand, Sheriff," he said, his voice now laced with a false sweetness. "You don't have a choice." The second man, shorter, stockier, shifted behind him, his hands tucked behind his back. Jake noticed the subtle flicker of movement, and his heart skipped a beat. The man was reaching for something, the handle of a metal object just barely visible beneath his jacket. Jake's muscles tightened as a wave of realization washed over him. This wasn't just a confrontation over a property violation. This was something far more dangerous. Before he could react, the second man took a step forward and shoved the clipboard into Jake's chest. "You're under arrest," the man barked, his voice rough and filled with authority. "Come with us, Sheriff." Now, Jake felt his breath catch. Under arrest. For what? His mind scrambled to process the situation. This had gone from a routine, if bizarre, encounter to an outright confrontation. Jake's instincts screamed that something wasn't right, but the men's movements were fast, coordinated, professional, even. Too professional. It felt like they had done this before. But Jake wasn't about to be intimidated. He steadied his breath and lifted his chin. "I don't think you know who you're dealing with. I am the sheriff of this town, and you're not going to get away with this. Not on my watch." His voice was low and steady, dripping with authority. The taller man sneered. "We know exactly who you are, Sheriff," he said. His words were cold, dismissive, as if the title meant nothing to him. "And it doesn't matter. You're coming with us, one way or another." The air between them seemed to thicken. Every muscle in Jake's body was coiled, ready to spring into action. He wasn't going to let these men take him, not without a fight. As the shorter man moved even closer, his hand finally revealed what he had been concealing, a set of handcuffs. The sight of them made Jake's heart race, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He could almost feel the cold metal against his wrists, the weight of it dragging him down. But something about the situation didn't sit right. Why would they go to these lengths? If they were really from the HOA, why weren't they using official channels? And why were they so eager to escalate things to physical force? "Step away from me," Jake said, his voice rising. "You don't want to do this." The taller man didn't flinch. In fact, he took another step forward, closing the distance between them. But then something unexpected happened. The man stopped. His eyes darted quickly to the side, his expression shifting. He was looking for something. A sudden jolt of panic shot through Jake's chest as his mind raced to catch up. Was someone else involved? Were they waiting for backup? Was this some kind of ambush? Jake's eyes flicked toward the street, but it was eerily quiet. The usual hum of suburban life, the sound of kids playing, dogs barking, was absent. The silence now felt ominous, as if the entire neighborhood had been swallowed up by a thick fog of uncertainty. "I'll say it one more time," Jake said, his voice hard. "You are not taking me anywhere. I'm giving you one last chance to explain yourselves before I call for backup." For a brief moment, the taller man faltered. Jake could see it, a flicker of uncertainty. Maybe they hadn't expected him to fight back so fiercely. But the hesitation was brief. The second man spoke up. "Enough of this," he growled, his hand tightening on the handcuffs. "You're coming with us, Sheriff." Jake's mind was racing, but his body was already moving. He couldn't let them lay a hand on him. He wasn't just going to back down. He had to stay in control. Whatever they were trying to pull, he couldn't let them succeed. In a flash, Jake took a step to the side, shifting his weight. He reached for his phone with one hand, ready to dial in a call for backup. But as he pulled it out, the air between them seemed to snap, and the shorter man made his move, lunging toward him, the handcuffs outstretched. It was happening. Jake's breath hitched, his mind racing as he braced himself for what came next. Time seemed to slow as the shorter man lunged forward, his movements sharp and fast, his fingers snapping for Jake's wrist. But Jake wasn't about to be caught off guard. He pivoted quickly, dodging the man's reach with a fluid motion that came naturally, instinctively. The air around him crackled with tension as he stepped back, his hand clutching his phone tight, his thumb hovering over the emergency button. "Don't come any closer," Jake barked, his voice now rising with authority, even as his heart raced. "You're making a mistake." The shorter man faltered, thrown off balance by Jake's swift movement. But the taller man didn't hesitate for a second. His cold, calculating eyes flicked over to the smaller figure, then back to Jake. The smile that had been on his lips earlier faded, replaced by something darker, something dangerous. "You're going to regret this, Sheriff," the tall man said, his voice now low, almost a growl. He took another step forward, his hand subtly sliding toward his own belt. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He knew that move. A weapon. He was reaching for something concealed under his jacket. A gun. The moment the realization hit, Jake's instincts kicked into overdrive. His hand shot down to his own sidearm, his fingers brushing the cold steel of his holster. He couldn't draw it just yet, not unless it was absolutely necessary. These men might be imposters, but they were playing a dangerous game. As the taller man continued to advance, his fingers brushing the grip of his gun, Jake stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just a confrontation over a violation of HOA rules. This was escalating into something far more serious. The tall man's eyes narrowed as he closed in on Jake, his lips curling into a taunting smile. "We don't want to hurt you, Sheriff," he said, his tone dripping with false reassurance. "But we'll do whatever it takes to get you to comply." Jake's grip tightened on his phone. He didn't trust a word coming out of the man's mouth. The first thing he'd learned as a law enforcement officer was that people like this rarely followed through on their threats, unless they were desperate. And right now, these two were looking more desperate by the second. "Who sent you?" Jake demanded, his voice sharp. "And why are you doing this? What's the real reason you're here?" The taller man paused, his expression flickering for just a moment, as if considering whether or not to answer. But the silence that followed only added to Jake's growing suspicion. They didn't want to reveal too much. They didn't want to answer any of his questions, and the longer they kept dodging, the more it became clear this wasn't about trash bins or some petty violation. Jake's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Impersonating law enforcement officers, carrying handcuffs, using intimidation tactics. It all pointed to something far darker. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being dragged into a web of deceit and corruption that went beyond just a rogue HOA faction. The shorter man, now regaining his footing, took another step forward, his hand still lingering near his side. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the next move, trying to predict what they'd do next. There was no way these men were just after a citation. There was something else at play, something much bigger. The taller man cleared his throat, his eyes locking onto Jake's with a chilling intensity. "You don't need to know all the details, Sheriff," he said slowly, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You just need to come with us, and everything will be fine." Jake's blood ran cold. Come with them. This wasn't about taking him to a courthouse or even giving him a fine. They weren't just after some petty revenge. They had a specific agenda, and Jake was in their way. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Whatever this was, it had nothing to do with the HOA. These men were just pawns in a much larger game. "Listen to me carefully," Jake said, his voice now firm and commanding. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm the sheriff of this town, and you don't have the authority to arrest me. You're impersonating law enforcement officers. That's a crime." The taller man's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else lurking in them, something that made Jake's stomach churn. Fear. For a split second, Jake saw it. The briefest flicker of hesitation in the man's eyes, a crack in his otherwise steely resolve. This wasn't the first time they'd faced resistance. They were playing a dangerous game, but they were far from invincible. And in that moment, Jake knew they were bluffing. He wasn't sure what they were really after, but it was clear now. They hadn't expected him to stand his ground. They hadn't expected a real sheriff to show up and call their bluff. Now, the tables were beginning to turn. Jake's breath steadied as he squared his shoulders, facing the two imposters head-on. He wasn't just going to sit back and let them take control. Not now. Not ever. He'd been the one to take an oath to protect and serve. And no matter what came next, he was going to make sure these men would never threaten his town, or anyone, again. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged with the weight of impending violence. Jake could feel the tension rising like a storm in the air. He stood firm, his hand still hovering near his holster, his body coiled like a spring, ready to react to the slightest shift in the situation. The taller man's eyes flickered with something close to desperation, the smile now gone from his face. His hand rested on the gun at his side, but he didn't draw it yet. Instead, he took another step forward, his voice cold and menacing. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Sheriff," he said, his words a low growl. "We gave you a chance to cooperate. Now we're taking you in, whether you like it or not." Jake's jaw tightened. They were threatening him. They'd been sizing him up from the beginning, but the game had changed. They weren't trying to scare him anymore. They were trying to force him into submission. And that was something Jake wasn't about to let happen. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the man in front of him. The taller man's expression betrayed a flicker of doubt. The hesitation was there again. The fear. Jake was certain now. These men weren't as in control as they pretended to be. Jake wasn't a rookie. He'd dealt with criminals before, gang members, drug dealers, even dangerous fugitives. But this was different. These men were playing a high-stakes game, and the stakes were more than just a few petty violations. There was something more behind their cold threats. His mind raced, quickly running through his options. He couldn't fight both of them head-on, not with them this close. But he didn't need to engage in a full-on brawl. He needed to outsmart them. "You don't get it, do you?" Jake said, his voice steady, cold. He was playing his part now, using his own threat as a weapon. "You're not going to get away with this. There's a reason I'm the sheriff. I don't go down easily." The shorter man, still positioned behind the taller figure, stiffened. Jake saw it, the brief flicker of unease in his posture. They were getting nervous. That was good. It meant they weren't as confident as they'd been moments ago. I'm giving you one last chance, Jake continued, taking a half step back, just enough to give himself a bit of breathing room. You don't want to make this worse. This isn't something you can walk away from. The taller man's lips thinned, and Jake saw the shift. The decision was made. In an instant, the man's hand shot to his holster, and Jake's pulse surged. He had no more time to think. With a speed that could only be described as instinctual, Jake drew his own weapon. The loud click of his holster being released echoed in the quiet night, a sound that seemed far too loud in the stillness. The barrel of his pistol aimed directly at the taller man's chest, the cold steel a clear message. The man froze, his fingers halfway to his own gun. Jake's voice was like ice. I don't want to shoot anyone tonight, but I will if it comes to that. You want to try me. The taller man's eyes widened slightly, his hand wavering mid-motion. He wasn't expecting this. Neither of them had been. The game had changed again. I don't want trouble, the taller man muttered, his bravado cracking. He took a step back, his hand slowly retreating from his gun. The shorter man, still visibly tense, looked between his partner and Jake, as if weighing their options. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Jake's gaze was unwavering, his pistol steady. Every second felt like an eternity. He could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of being caught in a lie they had no escape from. The tall man looked down, his shoulders slumping slightly in defeat. It wasn't over, but Jake had the upper hand. Who sent you? Jake demanded again, his voice sharp. His finger hovered over the trigger. He wasn't playing games anymore. The taller man hesitated. Jake could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to decide whether to reveal the truth. It was obvious now. These men weren't just working for some rogue HOA faction. They had an agenda, and it went far deeper than Jake could have imagined. The silence stretched on, and Jake's patience began to wear thin. His thumb brushed over the phone in his pocket, ready to make the call that would bring backup rushing in. But then, just when he thought he would have to escalate things further, the taller man muttered something barely audible. It's not just the HOA, he whispered. They're watching you, Sheriff. The real ones behind this. They're closer than you think. We were just sent to soften you up. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The words hit him like a sledgehammer. They weren't just after him. They were working for someone else. Someone more powerful. Someone who had a plan for him. And it was much bigger than a fake HOA violation. Before Jake could press for more answers, the man suddenly jerked back, his hand flying toward his jacket, as if reaching for something hidden. His eyes flicked to the shorter man, and without warning, they both turned and sprinted down the street. Jake's pulse raced. They were running, not just away from him, but toward something. Someone. With a quick glance over his shoulder to ensure no one was watching, Jake pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed in a number he knew by heart. The local dispatch. His mind was already racing with possibilities. Who was behind this? Who were these men working for? He wasn't about to let them slip away without answers. Jake didn't hesitate for a second. His fingers were already dialing as the two men disappeared around the corner, their footsteps fading into the night. The hum of his phone was drowned out by the sharp sting of adrenaline in his veins. Every instinct screamed at him to follow, to chase them down and get answers. But he knew he couldn't afford to lose focus. The stakes were too high. The phone rang 3 times before the voice on the other end crackled through the speaker. This is dispatch. How can I help you? Get me a squad car, Jake said, his voice clipped. 2 suspects impersonating law enforcement, possible armed threat. They're headed toward the south end of Maple Street, just off the main road. I need backup now. Understood, Sheriff. Units are on their way. Stay put and don't engage alone. Jake's grip tightened on his phone. Stay put. The words were almost laughable. These men were running, and he couldn't afford to wait. If they were working for someone more powerful, someone with resources, every second counted. Jake knew that if he hesitated too long, they'd disappear without a trace. "I can't wait. I'm going after them," Jake snapped, already moving toward the street. His boots hit the asphalt with a steady rhythm as he followed their trail, his mind calculating the route they'd take. They'd run down Maple Street. He knew it well. And there was only one place they could go from there: the abandoned mill at the edge of town. It was a perfect spot to hide out. He sprinted, his breath coming in sharp gasps as the cool night air burned his lungs. He could feel the rush of the chase, the pulsing rhythm of his heartbeat in his ears. But more than the thrill of the pursuit, there was an undeniable weight of urgency. The clock was ticking. As he reached the corner of Maple Street, Jake slowed, peering around the edge of the building. His eyes scanned the street ahead, searching for any sign of the two men. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long shadows over the empty pavement. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the sidearm at his hip, his fingers brushing the cold steel. He wasn't about to get caught off guard again. He needed to be ready for anything. A rustling sound broke the silence, a faint whisper of movement just ahead. Jake's eyes darted toward the noise. There, the shorter man. He was crouched low behind a rusted car parked near the mill. The figure was tense, alert, eyes scanning the darkness. He was waiting for something, or someone. Jake crouched instinctively, flattening against the side of the building as he carefully moved closer, his steps as quiet as possible. He could feel the tension building in his chest as the seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Just as he was about to make his move, a voice cut through the night, sharp and commanding. "Now, Jack, let's move." The voice came from the other side of the mill. The tall man. Jake's pulse surged. They were splitting up. This wasn't just a random retreat. They had a plan. One man was covering the exit, while the other was making a move somewhere else. But what was their endgame? Were they just trying to get away, or was there something bigger in play? Without thinking, Jake pushed himself off the wall, silently making his way around the back of the building. His mind raced. What were they hiding? They weren't just trying to escape. This was a diversion, a carefully orchestrated plan to get Jake off their trail. As he reached the edge of the mill, his heart hammered in his chest. He spotted movement again, a figure slipping into the mill's main entrance, the taller man. Jake's hand tightened on his gun. This was it. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He needed answers now, and if it meant confronting these two men head-on, so be it. Just as he was about to step into the open, he froze. A flicker of motion at the far end of the lot caught his eye. Another figure, hidden in the shadows. A third person. Jake's mind reeled. They were being watched. He quickly ducked behind the corner of a nearby structure, his pulse quickening. The presence of a third figure threw everything off. This wasn't just some rogue operation. They were part of something much larger. He needed to stay hidden, stay patient. He reached for his radio, carefully speaking into the mic, his voice low but urgent. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Daniels. I have eyes on multiple suspects. They're not alone. There's a third person. I need backup at the mill, immediately." The radio crackled. "Backup en route, Sheriff. Hold tight, don't engage." Jake didn't respond. The message was clear. He couldn't do this alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he watched the third figure step forward, revealing the faint outline of a dark jacket. This wasn't just some random bystander. This person knew exactly what they were doing. They were in control. Jake's fingers tightened around his gun, his senses on high alert. Something far bigger was unfolding before his eyes, something that he wasn't prepared for. And if he wasn't careful, he could be walking right into a trap. Jake stayed perfectly still, barely breathing as the third figure moved closer to the entrance of the mill. This person was moving with deliberate care, each step measured, as if they knew exactly where to go and what to avoid. The shadows seemed to bend around them, hiding their face, but Jake could tell they were armed. The weight of the situation hit him hard. Their presence confirmed everything he had feared. There was more to this than just a rogue operation. They weren't after him. They were orchestrating something much larger. Jake's grip tightened on his gun, his mind racing as he weighed his options. The figures ahead of him, both the tall man and the third person, were not just improvising. They were executing a plan, and Jake was in the middle of it. Every instinct screamed at him to back off, to wait for backup, but his gut told him that time was running out. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't going to wait for him to call for reinforcements. Suddenly, a voice cut through the dark night, smooth but commanding. "You're not alone, Sheriff." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The voice was cold, measured, and it came from behind him. His eyes widened as he spun around, his gun instinctively raised. But before he could react, a firm hand landed on his shoulder. "Easy, Sheriff," the voice said again, this time in a whisper. "You don't want to make a scene." Not yet. Jake's mind spun. He had been so focused on the men at the mill that he hadn't heard anyone approach from behind. He quickly took a step back, his instincts still on high alert. His finger hovered over the trigger, but the voice was unmistakable, familiar. He lowered the gun just a fraction, but he didn't let his guard down. "Who the hell are you?" The figure stepped into the light, revealing the last person Jake would have expected. Deputy Carla Reed, his trusted partner. "Carla." Jake's voice was a mix of disbelief and confusion. "What the hell are you doing here? I told you to stay back." She gave him a small, knowing smile, her eyes gleaming with a sharp intelligence. "Didn't seem like you were going to wait for backup, Sheriff. Thought I'd better step in." Jake's brain was struggling to process it all. Deputy Reed was one of his most loyal officers, but the way she'd appeared out of nowhere, just as the mystery deepened, it didn't sit right. Something about her presence felt like part of the puzzle. What was she involved in? Before he could ask, her voice lowered, tense with urgency. "There's no time. You're being played. All of this, the men at the mill, the fake HOA goons, they're just a distraction." Jake's mind whirred. A distraction. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "The third person. Do you know who they are?" Jake whispered, the words barely leaving his lips. Carla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, scanning the area with a practiced eye. Then, she spoke in a tone that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. "The person inside the mill is someone far more dangerous than you realize, Sheriff. And we've been trying to get to them for weeks. They're connected to something far bigger than this town." Jake's blood ran cold. Bigger than the town. His mind immediately flashed to the strange occurrences he'd noticed over the past few weeks. The unmarked trucks, the whispers in the dark, the odd meetings between officials he hadn't recognized. It was all starting to make sense now, but the implications were staggering. "We're too late, aren't we?" Jake muttered, more to himself than to Carla. He could feel it now, the weight of the conspiracy that had been building beneath the surface of his town. The quiet little place he thought he was protecting was just a front for something much more sinister. Carla didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told him everything. They were in way over their heads. "I don't know how deep this goes," Carla continued, her voice barely audible. "But you've got to trust me, Jake. The third person, the one you saw at the entrance, they're pulling the strings. They know you're here, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep you from getting to them." Jake clenched his jaw. He was being set up. Just then, the sound of a door creaking open reached his ears. Jake's instincts went into overdrive. They were making their move. He pulled Carla behind the corner of the building, crouching low. The mill was right in front of them now, the heavy wooden doors ajar, with a faint light spilling out from inside. A silhouette moved through the light, the third figure. Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was time. Carla looked at him, her expression unreadable. "We go in now. We risk everything. But if we wait, they're going to slip away." Jake nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't have the luxury of waiting anymore. The door to the mill was their only chance, but every step they took, could lead them straight into a trap. "I'm in," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "Let's do this." And with that, the two of them moved in, blending into the shadows, hearts racing, eyes sharp. The game had changed completely, and they were stepping into a nightmare much darker than they ever expected. Every step forward now carried the weight of a dozen unanswered questions, and they were about to find out the truth, whether they were ready for it or not. The air inside the mill was thick with dust, the smell of old wood and rust lingering in the dim light that filtered through cracks in the walls. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the old wooden planks beneath their boots. Jake's hand gripped his gun tighter, the cold metal reassuring, but he knew it wasn't going to be enough if things went south. Carla moved beside him, her every step deliberate, her eyes scanning the shadows. She was on edge too. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was a trap. Everything about it screamed danger. They slipped through the open doorway, crouching low, making their way deeper into the heart of the mill. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound, set Jake's nerves on edge. It felt like they were walking into a lion's den, and the walls were closing in around them. "You sure about this?" Jake whispered, his breath tight. Carla glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop them here, we'll never get another chance." Jake's pulse quickened. They were chasing shadows now, following the ghosts of a conspiracy they couldn't yet see in full. But everything was starting to align, the pieces of a puzzle he had been trying to solve for weeks, falling into place in real time. Ahead of them, the mill's interior stretched out in the dark, a labyrinth of old machinery and forgotten tools. The air felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of years of neglect. But there was something else, a faint hum in the air, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the building. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Jake's instincts screamed at him to move faster, but he held his ground. If there was a hidden agenda, the people pulling the strings were close, and they had been waiting for this moment. They rounded a corner, and Jake froze. In front of them, standing in the middle of a large open space, was the third figure. The one who had been watching them from the shadows, the one who had been pulling the strings all along. The figure was illuminated by the soft light of a nearby overhead lamp, but their face was hidden beneath a dark hood. They were holding something in their hands, a briefcase. Carla tensed beside Jake, her fingers brushing against the small of her back, where her own weapon was holstered. Jake's mind raced. This was it. The person behind the whole operation. "You've been a problem, Sheriff," the figure said, their voice smooth, like silk. "But it's time to end this." Jake took a step forward, his eyes locked on the briefcase. What was in it? What could be so important that these people were willing to go to such extremes to hide it? "Who the hell are you?" Jake demanded, his voice low, filled with authority. The tension in the air was palpable, thick as smoke. The figure's lips curled into a faint smile, but they didn't respond immediately. Instead, they stepped back, their movements deliberate, calculated. The sound of a door creaking open echoed behind them, and Jake's eyes flicked toward it. There in the doorway stood the two men, the tall one and the shorter figure who had first confronted Jake. They weren't alone. Behind them stood another figure, a woman, tall, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. She was dressed in dark, tactical clothing, her hands resting at her sides as though ready to spring into action at any moment. She didn't move, but her presence was enough to send a chill down Jake's spine. "I see you've met my associates," the hooded figure said, their voice dripping with disdain. "I'm sure you've realized by now that this isn't just some local dispute. No, this goes much deeper." Jake's stomach tightened. This was the beginning of something much bigger. He could feel Carla's gaze on him, waiting for him to make a move, but the situation was too volatile, too dangerous. He was outnumbered, and the odds were quickly stacking against them. The woman in the doorway spoke, her voice sharp. "You've been interfering with our plans long enough, Sheriff. It's time to put an end to it." Jake's mind raced. He needed to think quickly. There had to be a way out, a way to turn the tables before it was too late. They were closing in on him from all sides. The game had shifted, and he was no longer in control. The odds were overwhelming. But he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything he'd seen. These people needed to be stopped. Carla's voice broke the silence, her words low but resolute. "We're not going anywhere." The hooded figure's laugh was soft, almost mocking. "You think you have a choice." Jake's mind spun, each word echoing in his head like a warning bell. What was in that briefcase? Why was it so important? And why was the woman in the doorway so confident? Before he could react, the sound of a metallic click cut through the air. The figure holding the briefcase slowly opened it, revealing its contents. Inside were stacks of papers, blueprints, maps, plans. Jake's breath hitched. He didn't have to look twice to know what they were. These weren't just documents. They were the plans for something far bigger than this small town. Something that could change everything. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locking with Jake's, her expression cold and calculating. "Do you see now?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. "This is just the beginning." Jake's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the contents of the briefcase. The blueprints and maps weren't just city plans. They were detailed schematics for a complex network of operations that spanned beyond anything he had ever imagined. His mind whirred, trying to piece it together. What were these people really after? The woman in front of him smiled faintly, sensing his confusion. "These documents, they're the blueprint for a much larger operation, one that'll change the very fabric of this region. And you, Sheriff, are standing in our way." Jake's pulse quickened. He had underestimated the scope of what he was up against. This wasn't just about fake HOA cops or rogue operatives. This was a full-scale operation, and they had infiltrated everything. His town, his department, possibly even the government itself. He glanced at Carla, who was standing a little too still for comfort. She had a look on her face that Jake had never seen before. Resignation. Had she been involved in this from the beginning? His mind screamed for answers, but he couldn't afford to waste time asking questions. Not now. "You're making a mistake," Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos racing in his veins. "If you think you can just waltz in here and take control, you're wrong. You won't get away with this." The woman's smile never faltered, but her eyes hardened. "Sheriff, you're naive. You don't understand. This isn't just about power, it's about survival." She motioned to the blueprints, her fingers tracing the lines like she was caressing a weapon. "We've built something that's bigger than any one man. And now, it's too late for you to stop it." Jake's mind raced. Survival. What did she mean by that? Before he could form a response, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the silence outside. His heart skipped. Back up. The woman's expression didn't change, but Jake saw the flicker of concern in her eyes. She knew the game was up, at least it should have been. "Your friends won't be able to stop us," the woman said, her voice cold. "They're already too late." She raised her hand, signaling the two men at her side to step forward. Jake's eyes darted around the room, calculating his next move. The backup might be coming, but he couldn't trust it. The men in front of him were too well prepared, too confident. The entire mill felt like a powder keg waiting to explode, and Jake was at the center of it all. The tall man moved forward, his hands raised, a gun tucked against his side. "You're done, Sheriff," he said flatly. "We've got everything we need." Before Jake could react, Carla spoke up. "No, Jake, we have everything we need." Jake's heart pounded as he turned to look at her. Her gaze locked onto his, and for the first time, Jake saw something there, a determination, a spark of rebellion that had been missing in her demeanor. Carla had been playing them all along. "I'm not with them, Jake," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I've been tracking them for months, trying to gather enough evidence to bring them down. But I needed you to trust me, just long enough to get close." The woman in front of them sneered. "So the good deputy isn't as loyal as we thought. How quaint." She motioned to her men. "Deal with her." Before either Jake or Carla could react, the tall man lunged forward, his hand reaching for Carla. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Carla stepped back with practiced precision, her legs sweeping across his feet, sending him stumbling to the ground. It was like a switch had been flipped. The room erupted in chaos. Jake's gun was out in an instant, aiming straight at the woman's chest, but she was faster. She dove behind a stack of crates, her movements swift and fluid. Gunfire echoed as Jake returned fire, the bullets whizzing past her position. But the mill was too cluttered, too tight, and the shadows were thick with danger. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of sirens getting closer, but they were still too far away. They needed to end this. Now. Carla moved with lightning speed, taking advantage of the confusion. She was already across the room, pressing herself flat against the wall, her eyes sharp. She signaled Jake to follow her, and without hesitation, he moved toward her. They couldn't let this drag out. They needed answers, and they needed to stop the woman from escaping with whatever plans were in that briefcase. The gunfire paused for a split second as the woman's voice rang out from the shadows. "You think you've won, Sheriff." Her voice was like ice. "You're just a pawn. This is bigger than you'll ever understand." Jake's blood ran cold, but he didn't hesitate. He wasn't backing down. "Maybe so," he muttered, "but I'm not done fighting yet." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back of the mill, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone hitting the ground hard. The tall man's body dropped, unmoving, his gun skidding across the floor. Jake turned, surprised to see one of the backup units had finally arrived. They'd made it just in time. But the woman wasn't done. She was already moving again, slipping into the shadows, disappearing into the night. "Don't let her escape," Jake shouted, but it was too late. The woman was gone. The battle was far from over. The game was shifting, and Jake knew the truth now. The conspiracy was bigger than anyone had imagined, and the woman was just a part of it. Carla stepped up beside him, her expression unreadable. "This isn't over, Jake," she said quietly. "It's only just begun." Jake looked out into the darkness of the night, feeling the weight of what was still to come. The question wasn't whether they'd won. It was whether they could stop what was coming next. And the answer was still unclear.